She stood in the middle of a room full of diamonds and designer gowns, 300 people watching, wine dripping down the front of her dress, and the most powerful woman in the room, a billionaire's mother, had just called her a predator, out loud, in front of everyone. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she didn't say a single word. She just turned and walked out with her spine straight and her head up and one hand pressed quietly to her stomach. Because nobody in that ballroom knew what she was carrying. Not the 300 guests watching her walk away. Not the woman who had just destroyed her in public. Not even the man she loved. She was 11 weeks pregnant. And the woman who had just poured wine on her dress. The woman who called her a gold digger, a predator, a woman who didn't belong, was about to find out she had just attacked the mother of her own grandchild. What happens next is not a revenge story. It is something more powerful than that. It is the story of a woman who walked through the fire without flinching. Who told the truth when it terrified her? Who chose to build something real instead of something safe? And in doing so, changed everything. What this story will give you. Sometimes the most dignified thing you can do is simply refuse to fall apart in front of people who are waiting for you to. This is a story about that kind of strength, the quiet kind, the real kind, the kind that changes your life from the inside out. If this story speaks to something you felt, please leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you're new here, subscribe, because every week we bring you stories that remind you who you are.
The champagne flute hit the marble floor before Claire even registered what had happened. She heard the crack. Sharp, definitive, like something breaking that could never be put back together again. Then the silence. Not the comfortable silence of a room between songs, the other kind. The kind that happens when 300 people all stop breathing at exactly the same time. Claire stood in the center of the Holt Grand Ballroom. Crystal chandeliers blazed above her. Italian marble gleamed beneath her feet. 300 of Chicago's wealthiest citizens stared at her. And Vivian Holt's hand was still raised. The wine was on her dress, Cabernet Sauvignon, dark red, spreading across the cream silk like something alive. The dress Nathaniel had bought her for this exact occasion. The one she had worried was too much, too extravagant, too obvious a gift for a woman in her position. It was ruined now, but the dress wasn't the worst part. The words were the worst part. Vivian Holt had a voice built for projection, for boardrooms, for silencing opposition in a single sentence. She was 62 years old. She had been wielding that voice like a weapon for 40 of those years. She had used it tonight, and she had not whispered. "This is exactly what women like you do," Vivian had said. Clear, loud, deliberate. You find a vulnerable man, you wrap yourself around him, and you drain everything he has. A murmur moved through the crowd like water. "My son," Vivian continued, "is worth $1.4 billion. And you—" She looked Claire up and down with the slow precision of a woman who wanted everyone present to follow her gaze. "You are a 30-year-old receptionist who works in a building he owns." The wine came after, as punctuation. Claire had not moved, had not cried, had not said a single word. She was trying to breathe. Just breathe, Claire, just breathe. Her hand had gone to her stomach without thinking. A reflex, gentle, protective. The way it had been doing for 3 weeks. Ever since the test, ever since the 2 pink lines that had rearranged the entire landscape of her life in the span of 60 seconds in a gas station bathroom at 7 in the morning. Nobody in this room knew about that yet. Not the 300 guests, not Vivian Holt, not even Nathaniel. Claire's eyes found him across the ballroom. He was moving through the crowd, fast, threading between people in tuxedos and gowns with the particular focus of a man who had just witnessed something catastrophic and was trying to reach the wreckage. His face was something she had never seen on him before, not in 14 months of knowing him, not in 10 months of loving him. He looked devastated. She needed to get out of this room before she fell apart. She turned, walked toward the exit. Steady steps. 1, 2, 3. She would not run. She would not give this room the satisfaction of watching her run. The click of her heels on marble was the only sound. 300 people watched her walk. She could feel every single gaze, some pitying, some curious, some, and this was the one that cut the deepest, satisfied. Behind her, she heard Nathaniel's voice. Mother. Low, controlled, absolutely terrifying. What did you just do? Claire pushed through the ballroom door, and then she was in the corridor. Gold-framed mirrors lining the walls, thick burgundy carpet beneath her feet, the sound of the party muffled behind heavy mahogany doors. She made it to the alcove near the coat check before her legs stopped cooperating. She leaned against the wall, cold marble pressed against her back. The wine smell rose from her chest, sharp and dark. Her hand pressed flat against her stomach. Nobody out here, just her, just the quiet. She closed her eyes. God. Okay. 300 people. 300 people had just watched Vivian Holt publicly execute her. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, was that half of them had probably nodded along internally. Because women like Vivian didn't become women like Vivian by being wrong about everything. Claire Whitman, daughter of a high school teacher and an electrician, grew up in Evanston in a house that needed a new roof every decade. Went to state school on scholarships because that was what you did when the money ran out before the ambition did. Worked her way from temp positions to senior executive assistant to head of office operations for Holt Financial Chicago. Not exactly a match for the Holt family legacy. She had known that from the beginning. Nathaniel had never seemed to care. His mother cared enough for both of them, and for the entire room, apparently. Claire pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, felt her eyes burn. She would not cry in this hallway. She was 30 years old. She had a spine. She checked her phone. Pure habit. Unlocked it. Locked it. Unlocked it again. Set it face down. There was no one to call right now. Her best friend Brenda would pick up on the first ring and say exactly the right thing in exactly the wrong moment, and Claire would completely lose it. Her mother was in Florida. And Nathaniel... The corridor door opened. He came through it like he had been running. Nathaniel Holt was 34 years old, dark hair, square jaw, the kind of eyes that had always made Claire feel like the only person in whatever room they were in. Tonight, those eyes were filled with something that looked very much like guilt. He stopped when he saw her. Claire, don't! She held up one hand. Not angry, just not ready. He stopped. Good. He was smart enough to stop. The silence between them was long and complicated and loaded with everything that had been building for 11 months. I'm sorry, he said finally. I am so sorry. I had no idea she would... Did you know she was going to give a speech tonight? A pause, just long enough to matter. She told me she wanted to say a few words about the foundation. I thought about the foundation. Claire looked at him directly. Right. He took a step forward. She took a step back. Not away from him exactly, just maintaining the distance she needed to keep her thoughts organized. She's been getting worse, he said. I know that. I've been handling it wrong. I've been handling everything wrong, and Nathaniel? She closed her eyes for one breath. I am covered in wine, in front of your entire world. She called me a predator. She did that deliberately, in public, in front of everyone who matters to you. And I need you to understand that this is not something I can just process in a hotel corridor. She stopped herself. Her hand had gone to her stomach again. She noticed it this time, made herself put it down slowly. What? He was watching her closely. Nothing. She shook her head. I need to go home. I need to get out of this dress, and I need to... Please don't leave like this. I'm not leaving like anything. I'm just leaving. She took her coat from the rack. The coat check girl was studying the ceiling with tremendous focus. Claire didn't blame her. This was not a situation anyone wanted to be standing near. I'll call you tomorrow, Claire said. When I've had time to... Claire. Tomorrow, Nathaniel. She walked out of the Holt Grand Hotel and into the November cold. The air hit her face, sharp and clean. She flagged a cab. Sat in the back, with her coat pulled over her ruined dress. The city lights slid past the window in streaks of gold and red. Her hand went back to her stomach, very gently. The way you touch something you are afraid of. The way you touch something you are afraid of losing. 11 weeks. She had been keeping this secret for 3 weeks. The baby had been there for 11. And Vivian Holt had just declared war on her in front of 300 witnesses. Claire pressed her forehead against the cold cab window and watched Chicago move outside in the dark. She wasn't going to fall apart in this cab. She wasn't going to fall apart at all. Falling apart was a luxury she could not afford right now, but she let herself feel it. Just for the length of this cab ride, the humiliation, the shock, the particular kind of pain that comes when someone attacks you in the place you were most trying to earn acceptance. I was so stupid. The signs were all there. She had seen them. That was the thing. She had seen every single warning sign, and she had told herself she was being paranoid. The cab stopped outside her building. She paid with cash, went upstairs, unlocked her apartment door, stood in the dark for a moment. The wine smell was everywhere. She went to the bathroom, ran the shower very hot, stood under it fully clothed for a moment, the ruined dress, the silk turning dark and heavy with water, before she finally reached down and unzipped it and let it fall. She stayed in the shower for a long time, the hot water running over her shoulders, the steam filling the small white bathroom. She pressed both hands to her still flat stomach. 11 weeks, she thought. You have no idea what kind of world you're coming into. But I promise you, I am going to figure this out before you get here. That's my job now. She turned off the shower, dried off, put on the softest pajamas she owned, went to the kitchen, and then she did what she always did when her mind was too loud to manage. She reorganized the kitchen at midnight, every drawer pulled open, contents spread on the counter, reordered by frequency of use, the spice cabinet alphabetized. Again, it had slipped since August, the pantry sorted by category and then subcategory, grains with grains, canned goods by type. By 2 a.m, her kitchen was immaculate. Her thoughts were marginally more organized. She sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet and a glass of water in her hand and the quiet of the apartment around her. I'm not crazy. I know what I saw. I saw it building for months, and I told myself I was wrong. I was not wrong. She sat there until 3. Then she went to bed, lay in the dark, with her hand on her stomach. Tomorrow, she thought. I'll figure out tomorrow what to say. She did not sleep for a long time. The photos went online before Claire was awake. She found out at 7:15 the next morning. Brenda's text came first, then 17 more texts in rapid succession from people she hadn't heard from in months. The kind of people who reach out only when something significant has happened and they want to be adjacent to it. She did not look at the photos. She made tea instead. Ginger. Her stomach had been uncertain since week 7, and mornings were still the hardest part. She wrapped both hands around the mug and sat at her clean kitchen counter and made herself think clearly. Here was what she knew. She was 30 years old. She was 11 weeks pregnant. The father was a billionaire whose mother had publicly poured wine on her last night in front of 300 people. The photos were circulating, and she had not yet told the father about the baby. This was, objectively, a complicated situation. Her phone buzzed again. Brenda. Brenda, I just saw the photo. Are you okay? Call me. Claire called her. Brenda picked up before the first ring finished. Tell me everything. Start from the second you walked into that ballroom. Leave nothing out. So Claire told her. The gala, the speech, the wine, Nathaniel's face in the corridor, the cab home, the shower, the kitchen reorganization. The kitchen again, Brenda said. Not surprised. The spices had slipped. They always slip at the worst moments. A pause. Claire, the comments on the photos. People are on your side, like, overwhelmingly. That's not what I care about. I know, but I thought you should know. Silence. Bryn, Claire said. Yeah? I need to tell you something. A long pause. Brenda had known Claire for 12 years. She could read a pause. Okay, she said carefully. I'm pregnant. 3 seconds of silence. How long have you known? 3 weeks. And Nathaniel? Doesn't know yet. Another silence. Longer. Claire? Brenda's voice was very gentle. You have to tell him. I know. Before this, all of this, gets any more tangled. I know, Bryn. Because if his mother finds out before he does, I know. Claire pressed her hand to her stomach. It had become reflex now, automatic as breathing. I know. After she hung up, Claire sat for a while. She thought about how she had gotten here. Not the pregnancy. She understood the biology. She meant here, at 30 years old, at this specific intersection of her life with all of these complications converging at once. She thought about a year ago, before Nathaniel, before any of this. She had been perfectly fine. Not perfect, but fine. She had her apartment, her work, her 45-minute lunch breaks with a book, her friendships, her impeccably organized kitchen. She had not been looking for anything. That was the honest truth that people never believed. She had been at her desk at 7:45 on a Tuesday morning, coffee in one hand, reading glasses on, annotating a vendor contract because the previous executive assistant had left the filing system in shambles, and Claire was constitutionally unable to leave a mess alone. Nathaniel Holt had come through the lobby with 3 men in suits and a phone to his ear. She had noticed him the way you notice a disturbance in the air. Something large moving quickly. She had gone back to her contract. He stopped at her desk. You're new? He said. 6 weeks, she said, without looking up. Technically, I'm not new. I'm just newer than most. A pause. Something that might have been amusement in his voice. Fair enough? He kept walking. That was the whole first meeting, 30 seconds. She had forgotten about it by noon. He came back at noon and stood at her desk for 4 minutes, asking specific questions about the vendor contract he had apparently noticed over her shoulder on the way in. Because he found the details of other people's paperwork genuinely interesting, which was, she would later understand, exactly how he had built an empire. She answered his questions, directly, without performing the particular kind of careful charm that people deploy when they suddenly realize who they are talking to. He was just a man asking reasonable questions about a contract. She had reasonable answers. He asked her to lunch. She said no. That had clearly surprised him. She could see it without looking up. A slight recalibration. I have lunch plans, she explained, which was true. She ate at her desk and read for 45 minutes every day, and it was the best part of her workday. She was not giving it up for anyone. Tomorrow? He asked. I have lunch plans every day, she said. It's a thing. He had laughed then, a real laugh, surprised out of him. he asked her to dinner instead. She said yes to that. Dinner had been at a restaurant, without prices on the menu. Claire had ordered the salmon and tried not to let any of it show on her face. It was the best salmon she had ever eaten. But the company was better. Nathaniel was funny. Not the performed kind of funny, the kind that comes from actually paying attention to the world. He noticed things. He asked questions and then listened to the answers, which Claire had discovered was rarer than people like to admit. She told him about growing up in Evanston. He told her about growing up in a house with a name, which he said with enough self-awareness that she liked him immediately for it. She told him about her father teaching her to read wiring diagrams at age 8 because he considered it an essential life skill. He told her about his father dying when he was 22 and having to figure out what to do with an empire he hadn't expected to inherit for another 40 years. That's a lot of weight, she said. Yeah. He looked at his wine. My mother took it very hard. She had been the power behind my father for a long time. When he died, she transferred that energy to managing me. Claire had filed that away carefully. She hadn't known yet what it would mean. They dated for 4 months before he took her to meet Vivian. Claire had prepared, had reminded herself of every reason she was a capable, worthy, interesting person, had put on the nicest thing she owned. Vivian had looked at her like a stain on a carpet she was trying to identify. Not overtly rude, not yet, just cool. Assessing. The way you look at a painting you have decided you don't like before you have properly looked at it. So you work in one of Nathaniel's buildings, Vivian said over dinner. For a company that leases space in one of his buildings, Claire said. I run office operations for Holt Financial Chicago. A sip of wine. And before that? Executive assistant positions at 3 different firms over 6 years. I worked my way up to director level. An interesting career path. The way she said interesting carried an entire separate meaning underneath it. Nathaniel had changed the subject, smoothly, practiced. Claire had watched him do it and understood for the first time that he was very, very good at redirecting his mother, which meant he had been doing it for a very long time. On the drive home, he said, "She's warming up to you." Claire looked out the window. Is that what that was? He took her hand. She'll come around. He had believed it. She could tell. He genuinely believed it. He was wrong. 9 months later, standing in her apartment the morning after the gala with ginger tea and a secret, Claire understood something she should have understood in September. Maybe earlier. Vivian had never been warming up. Vivian had been strategizing. There was a difference. And Claire, who was smart, who paid attention, who noticed things, had missed it, or had refused to see it. Because seeing it would have meant confronting something she wasn't ready to confront. There had been a dinner at the estate in March. 8 people at the table, Vivian's friends, their husbands, and a woman named Sutton, tall, elegant, 41, recently divorced, family money going back 3 generations, seated directly across from Nathaniel. Vivian had kept directing conversation to Sutton, creating space for her, drawing her into the center. Nathaniel had not seemed to notice. Claire had driven home alone that night. Needed the 45 minutes. Did not turn on music. Just drove. She had reorganized the kitchen when she got home. By 2 in the morning, everything was perfectly ordered. Her thoughts had not been, but she had told herself she was being paranoid, being insecure, being unfair to a woman who had lost her husband young and was fiercely protective of her only son. Was that so terrible? I was gaslighting myself, she thought now. Is that even possible? Can you gaslight yourself? Apparently yes, because Vivian had never hidden her feelings. She had simply wrapped them in manners, in social armor, in plausible deniability. And the gala had been the moment she put the armor down, which meant something had changed 3 weeks ago. Something had accelerated Vivian's timeline. Claire turned this over carefully. 3 weeks ago, she had told Nathaniel she wanted to talk about their future, not the pregnancy. She hadn't known yet, just where were they going? Was this serious for both of them the way it was serious for her? He had said, absolutely. Let's have dinner. Just the two of us. I'll tell my mother I can't make Sunday. Sunday dinner with Vivian was a weekly institution. He had canceled it. For Claire. That was the change. That was the moment Vivian had decided the polite campaign was taking too long. Claire set down her mug. I was not wrong. I was not paranoid. I saw it building in real time and convinced myself I was dramatic. I am not dramatic. I know what I saw. She picked up her phone. She needed to call Nathaniel. She had been avoiding it since last night. Long enough. He answered on the first ring. Claire? His voice did something to her chest that she was choosing in this moment to ignore. I've been waiting. I know. I needed a few hours. Of course. A pause. Can I see you? She closed her eyes. Yes, but Nathaniel, we have to actually talk. Not around it. Not just about last night. About all of it. A silence that lasted long enough to tell her he understood exactly what she meant. Yes, he said finally. We do. Come tonight, 7. I'll be there. She had 9 hours. She spent one of them on the phone with her doctor's office, getting the results she'd been waiting for from her blood work. Everything healthy. Everything progressing normally for 11 weeks. Congratulations, the nurse said. Everything looks wonderful. Claire sat on the bathroom floor for a few minutes after she hung up. Just sat there, on the cold tile, with her hand on her stomach and the city noise coming through the window. Then she stood up, made a real dinner, roast chicken with lemon and herbs, her mother's recipe. The one that required enough attention that your mind had to be present. The apartment filled with the smell of rosemary and warmth. She set the table, 2 places, poured water into glasses. At 7 exactly the doorbell rang. Nathaniel stood in her doorway with dark circles under his eyes and a look on his face like a man who had not slept. You look terrible, she said. I know. He stepped inside, looked around her small, organized apartment with the careful attention he always gave things she cared about. Something smells incredible. Sit down, she said. We'll eat. Talk after. They ate quietly. The food was good. The quiet was necessary. They had both been carrying things all day, and neither of them was ready to set them down in the wrong order. When she put down her fork, he looked up. Tell me where you're at, she said. Before I say anything, tell me what you're thinking. He looked at her across the small table, the candlelight between them. I think, he said carefully, that I have been managing my mother for 12 years. Since my father died, I redirect her. I give her just enough control that she doesn't feel out of control. And I have been so practiced at doing it that I stopped actually seeing it. He paused. The gala was not an accident, he said. I know that. She planned it. She chose that moment deliberately. Yes, Claire said. She did. I am sorry. Not just for the gala. For every time I should have said something and redirected instead. Claire looked at her hands, then back at him. I need to tell you something, she said. Before we go any further, I need you to just listen. Can you do that? He went very still, the particular stillness of someone who understands that what comes next is significant. Yes, he said. She looked at him directly. I'm pregnant, she said. He did not move. Claire counted. 1, 2, 3, 4 seconds. She watched the information travel through him. His face was doing several things simultaneously. Shock, yes, but underneath the shock, something she hadn't expected, something that looked like relief. "How long?" he said. 11 weeks. She kept her voice even. "I found out 3 weeks ago. I know I should have told you immediately. I was trying to figure out, Claire. I wasn't keeping it from you because I didn't want to tell you. I was trying to find the right, Claire." Softer. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. His hands were warm, very steady. "Are you okay? Physically, are you okay?" She blinked. That was not the first question she had been braced for. Yeah, she said. "Blood work was good. Everything is normal." He nodded slowly. She could feel the steadiness in his hands around hers. "I'm going to ask you something," he said. "And whatever your answer is, that is your answer. I am not going to pressure anything. Okay? Do you want this baby?" She had been braced for logistical questions, practical questions, questions about timing and planning, and what do we do now, not that one. Something cracked open in her chest. Just a little. "Yes," she said. The word came out smaller and more honest than she intended. "I really do." He exhaled, long and slow. "Good," he said. His voice was quiet. "Because I—" He stopped, shook his head. "Claire, I'm going to need a minute." A sound came out of her. Not quite a laugh. Something relieved and startled and almost tearful all at once. "Take your time," she said. He stood up, walked to her kitchen window, looked out at the city below. November dark. Lights of traffic moving 7 floors down. He stood with his weight on his left foot and his right hand at the back of his neck. The thinking posture. She had learned to recognize it. "Okay," he said quietly, mostly to himself. He turned back to her. "I want to be very clear about something," he said. "I want you to take me at my word. Even though I know, given the last 24 hours, my word might feel less reliable than it should right now." She waited. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been in love with you for a long time. The fact that you are carrying our child does not change anything that was already true. This is not me stepping up because circumstances demand it. This is—" He stopped, put his hand over his face briefly. "This is the best news I've received in years, and I am still processing it." Claire stared at him. "Don't cry," she told herself firmly. She cried a little anyway, just a small amount, entirely involuntary. He crossed the kitchen and wrapped his arms around her. She put her face against his chest. The tears were brief and warm, and she did not try to stop them, because sometimes you spend 3 weeks carrying something alone, and when you finally put it down, your body just needs a moment. "I was so scared to tell you," she admitted, against his shirt. "It's okay. It's not really. You deserve to know sooner." "You're telling me now?" His arms tightened. "That's what matters." They stood like that until she stepped back, wiped her face, reached for her water glass, with the dignity of a woman who had cried in front of this man before and was comfortable with it. "We still need to talk about Vivian," she said. His expression shifted. Something tightened behind his eyes. "Yes," he said. "And now there's considerably more to discuss." He nodded. She could see him understanding the full weight of it. A grandchild, his mother's grandchild, growing in the body of the woman his mother had just publicly destroyed. "She can't know yet," Claire said. "Not until we figure out where we stand. Not until we—" "Agreed," he said immediately. "Absolutely." But she could see behind his eyes the enormousness of what was coming. The revelation was coming. She could not prevent it forever. She pressed her hand to her stomach under the edge of the table. A private gesture, just for herself and the small, lime-sized life she was carrying. "Whatever she does," Nathaniel said, reading something in her face, "I will not let it touch you, or the baby." Claire looked at him. I want to believe that, she thought. I genuinely do. But wanting to believe something and being able to rely on it are two very different things. I have spent 11 months wanting to believe Vivienne would come around, and I know now how that turned out. But she looked at him, and she saw the man who had said the best news I've received in years. She saw the man who had asked if she was physically okay before asking anything else. Okay, she said. And for that night, that was enough. But after he left at midnight, she sat in the kitchen again, not reorganizing this time, just sitting, with the remains of the roast chicken on the counter and the candles burned down and the city quiet outside. She thought about her parents, her father, and his wiring diagrams, her mother's roast chicken recipe, the house in Evanston with the roof that needed replacing, the particular happiness of a life built on what you could actually afford. She had never felt ashamed of any of it. She had felt in Vivienne's presence like she was supposed to, and she had let that in. Just enough. Just a little. The steady drip of Vivienne's subtle evaluations, the way she said interesting, the way she didn't ask about Claire's work, the way she introduced her to people as a friend of Nathaniel's. She had let that in and turned it on herself, made herself smaller to fit into a space that was never going to be big enough. I deserved better than that. I knew it every single time. And I kept walking back in anyway. She understood why. She had loved Nathaniel, still did. And loving someone means you try for the things that matter to them. Trying for Vivienne mattered to Nathaniel. But somewhere in all that trying, she had agreed, quietly, without anyone asking her to, that her value was something she needed to demonstrate. That was the part she needed to undo, not the love, the apologizing for existing part. That part was done. She pressed her hand to her stomach one more time before she went to bed. We're going to be okay, she said silently. I don't know exactly how yet, but we are going to be okay. The week after the gala was the quietest and loudest week of Claire's life simultaneously. Quiet because she stayed home. Because she took the medical leave her body needed anyway. Because she moved through her apartment slowly, eating crackers for the morning nausea, and drinking ginger tea and reading the same 3 pages of her book, repeatedly, without absorbing any of them. Loud because the world outside was not quiet at all. Brenda called every morning, forwarded articles, sent voice memos that were part outrage and part genuine delight at the public reckoning being directed at Vivienne Holt. They're comparing her to a Disney villain, Brenda reported on Wednesday, which I find personally satisfying. I feel like a human interest story, Claire said. You are a human interest story. I don't want to be. I know. But the narrative out there is completely on your side, and I want you to know that because I feel like you're sitting in your apartment deciding you did something wrong. Claire was quiet. Are you? Brenda asked. No, Claire said, and meant it. I'm just tired of being a story. I want to be a person. You're both, Brenda said gently. Right now, you're both. She was right. Claire read some of the articles, not for vanity, for information. She needed to understand what the public narrative was because it would eventually affect her life in concrete ways. The Business Journal piece was the most interesting. It framed the gala incident as a symptom of something larger. The way old wealth treats partners from different economic backgrounds as threats to inheritance. The way billionaire family dynamics create these particular kinds of control structures. She read that piece 3 times. She had lived every paragraph, but what she kept coming back to was a comment thread. Not the main comments. A specific subthread started by a woman who said, "I stayed in a situation like this for 4 years, waiting for his mother to accept me. I finally understood she was not going to accept me because accepting me meant accepting that her son had made a choice without her. It was never about me. It was about control." 47 women had replied with variations of the same story. Claire sat with that for a long time. Was that Vivian? Was this never actually about Claire at all? She thought about the timeline. Vivian's sustained campaign had intensified exactly when Nathaniel had started making choices independently. The canceled Sunday dinner. The apartment he had offered Claire that she had declined to let him pay for. The foundation fundraiser where Nathaniel had put Claire's name in the program as his partner. Every escalation corresponded to an act of Nathaniel's autonomy. Claire was not the problem. She was the symbol of the problem. That was a different thing, a more complicated thing. And somehow, it made Vivian both more understandable and more infuriating simultaneously. She picked up her phone and called her mother. Her mother was in Florida with her sister, theoretically on vacation, actually mostly calling family every day because she couldn't go more than 48 hours without checking on everyone. She picked up on the second ring. "Sweetheart, I was just about to call you. I saw—" "I know, Mom. Are you okay?" "I'm okay." Claire sat down on the couch, pulled a blanket over her feet. "I need to talk to you about something." "Is it the situation with that woman? Because I have some thoughts. It's not that. Or it's related. Mom." She took a breath. "I'm pregnant." A silence. Then, "Oh, sweetheart." Not shock, not judgment, just warmth. Pure, simple warmth. The kind only mothers produce in that particular key. "How far along?" her mother asked. 11 weeks. And the father knows. As of last night, he was— "Mom, he was wonderful about it." "Of course he was." Her mother's voice was very steady. "Has he met his daughter?" Claire paused. "I don't know the sex yet." "I know," her mother said, as if this was a minor detail. "Has he met his child yet?" "The ultrasound is next week." A long pause. Then her mother said, "Claire, I want to say something, and I want you to hear it." "Okay." What happened at that event was not about your worth. It was not about whether you deserve that man or that life. It was about a woman who is afraid of losing her grip on something she's been holding for a very long time. And people who are losing their grip do not behave with grace. Claire's eyes burned. "You behaved with more grace than I would have, Hamafkisam," her mother continued, "walking out of that room the way you did, with your head up. I am so proud of you." She cried then. The real way. The way she hadn't let herself cry in front of anyone. She cried with the phone pressed to her ear and her mother's voice saying, I'm here, it's okay," on the other end. When she was done, her mother said, "When can I come up?" "After the holidays," Claire said. "After things settle. I'll let you know when. I'll come whenever you say the word." "I know, Mom." She wiped her face. "Thank you." After she hung up, the apartment felt different. Smaller, in a good way, more contained. Her mother's voice had put walls back where the weak had knocked them down. She thought about what her mother had said. About Grace. She thought about the woman she'd been at the gala, standing in the center of the room with wine dripping from her dress. 300 people watching, the way she had simply turned and walked toward the door. She hadn't planned that. There was no strategy in it. She had just known that running was not an option, that breaking down in that ballroom was not an option, that giving Vivian the satisfaction of a scene was absolutely not an option. She had simply been herself, under the worst possible conditions. And being herself had meant spine straight, Head up, walk. That was all she had done. And apparently, it was enough. Starting over at 30 was not something she had planned. This entire situation was not something she had planned. But she was here. She was upright. She was carrying a child, and she was not going to apologize for any of it. The thought arrived quietly. Not like a revelation. More like something she had already known, settling into the right place. Starting over feels impossible, sometimes. But staying invisible, staying apologetic, staying smaller than you are, that feels worse. She got up off the couch, made herself a proper meal for the first time since the gala, eggs and toast, and the good orange juice, sat at her clean kitchen table, and ate it slowly. The morning light came through her window, clear, November sharp. She had an ultrasound appointment in 6 days. She had a conversation with Nathaniel that was not finished. She had a very large, very complicated future approaching at speed. She was going to eat her eggs, and then she was going to make a list. Because Claire Whitman made lists when things needed organizing, and things needed organizing, she found a notepad, wrote at the top, "What happens next?" Then she started writing. On the 6th day, Vivian showed up. Claire had been expecting a phone call, a formal letter through attorneys, a statement of some kind delivered through Nathaniel, something at a remove, something with the buffer of process. She had not expected a town car pulling up to her building at 2 in the afternoon on a Saturday. She was in the lobby getting a package from the front desk when she heard the car outside. She recognized it before she looked. The Holt family had used the same car service for 30 years. Same cars, same drivers. She stood very still. The lobby door opened. Vivian walked in. Vivian, charcoal cashmere coat, pearl earrings, hair perfect. The full armor of 62 years of knowing how to enter a room. She stopped when she saw Claire, and something in her face shifted. Not hostility, not the cool politeness, not the contempt of the gala. Something Claire did not immediately have a name for. "Claire," Vivian said. "Mrs. Holt." Claire kept her voice level, held her package against her chest. I came to speak with you." Quiet, still composed, but quieter than usual. "I thought Sunday was the plan." "Yes." A pause. "I decided not to wait." Claire studied her. Every instinct said, "Do not let this woman inside your apartment. Do not give her territory. Do not let her set the terms." But another instinct, quieter, harder to name, said, "Look at her face. Really look." Vivienne was not a stupid woman. She was not a cartoon villain. She was 62 years old. She had lost her husband young and reorganized her entire identity around what remained: her son, her family's legacy, the world she had carefully tended for 40 years. That world now had a crack in it that she had not anticipated, and she was standing in Claire's lobby, alone, without Patrice, without an agenda visible on her face. That meant something. "We can speak in the lobby," Claire said. "There are chairs by the window." She gestured to the seating area near the front. Neutral ground. Neither Claire's territory nor Vivienne's. Vivienne nodded and followed. They sat across from each other in the lobby chairs, a Saturday afternoon, the building quiet, the doorman at his desk, pretending with great effort to read. Vivienne set her handbag on her lap, folded her hands over it. The posture of a woman who had performed composure for 40 years and was performing it now. Then she said, "I owe you an apology." Claire blinked. "For the gala." Vivienne's voice was very precise. "What I did was—" A pause. Choosing words. Always choosing words. "Cruel. It was cruel. And I have spent the past week constructing reasons why it was justified, and I have been unable to sustain any of them. Claire looked at her. "Why now?" she said. "What changed?" A silence that stretched long enough to tell Claire the answer was important. "I know about the pregnancy," Vivian said. The air in the lobby went very still. Claire kept her face composed. She was very good at composed. She had been practicing for 11 months. "How?" she said. "Patrice has resources." Vivian said it with the neutrality of stating a fact she had previously found useful and was no longer comfortable with. "I was informed 6 days ago." 6 days. The morning after the gala. Vivian had known for 6 days and had waited until now to come. 6 days, Claire said carefully. "You've had 6 days to think about what that means." "Yes," Vivian said. "And what did you decide?" Vivian looked down the lobby window. The November street, the bare trees standing in their iron grates along the sidewalk. "I am going to be a grandmother," she said, in a tone that was entirely different from anything Claire had ever heard from her. Flatter, more stripped down, like someone still getting used to the weight of the words. "That child will be mine, in the way that matters." Claire kept her hands still in her lap. This was not what she had been bracing for. She had been bracing for demands, for conditions, for Vivian explaining the terms under which she would accept this development. She had not been bracing for Vivian sitting in a lobby chair, looking like a woman who had been rearranged by information she hadn't asked for. "I behaved," Vivian continued, turning back to face Claire, "as though I was operating on a timeline that no longer applies. Nathaniel is 34 years old. He does not need management." She paused. "He needs room. I have not been giving him room." "No," Claire said quietly. "You haven't." Vivian absorbed that without flinching, which was itself significant. "The gala was an attempt to accelerate a situation I believed I was losing control of," she said. "A public declaration is harder to reverse than a private one. I calculated that it would resolve things more quickly." Another pause. "I miscalculated." "You tried to humiliate me in front of the people who matter most to you and your son," Claire said. Her voice was steady. "That is more than a miscalculation." "Yes." The word landed simply, without qualification. Claire looked at this woman, this complicated, difficult, defensive, fiercely loving, and fiercely controlling woman. This woman who was going to be her child's grandmother regardless of what either of them wanted. I deserved better than what happened at that gala. I know that without needing to be told. I know my own worth. That is not something I am going to negotiate with anyone. But I am also not going to pretend this woman is not capable of being more than what I have seen from her, because nobody is only their worst moment. I have to believe that, for the sake of what comes next. "What do you actually want from me?" Claire asked. "Coming here today, not the apology, what do you actually want?" A long pause, the longest yet. "I want to understand who you are," Vivian said, "without the filter of my own fear." Claire sat with that. "You had a file on me," she said. "Yes." "What was in it?" "Your family background, your work history. Nathaniel's previous serious relationship ended. Badly. She was not what she appeared to be. I was operating from that experience." A pause. "I transferred those fears onto you without evidence." "Without evidence?" Claire repeated. "You had no evidence I was anything other than what I am. Correct? And yet?" "And yet?" Vivian met her eyes directly for the first time. "I chose fear over observation. That was a failure of judgment." The lobby was very quiet around them. "Here's what I want you to understand," Claire said finally. "I am not a threat to your son. I have never tried to take him from anything or anyone. I love him. And I have spent 11 months working to earn your approval, even while you were actively working against me. I don't think I should have had to do that, but I did it because I understood, even when it frustrated me, why you were afraid. Vivian listened. Her expression was that careful stillness she used as a shield. I'm done earning approval, Claire said. That part is over. But, she paused, considered. I am willing to know you. If you are willing to actually know me, not the file. Me. The silence stretched. Then Vivian said, that would require considerable adjustment on my part. Yes, it would. A pause. I am not, Vivian began, very good at adjustment. I know. But I am better at it than last week's evidence might suggest. Something moved in Claire's chest. Not warmth exactly, not forgiveness, not yet. Something adjacent to both. A door that had been sealed opening by the smallest possible amount. Then we'll start there, Claire said. She did not say it was okay. She did not pretend the gala hadn't happened. She did not perform anything. But she left the door open. Vivian stood, straightened her coat, picked up her handbag with the precise movements of a woman who does everything with precision. At the lobby door, she turned. The due date, she said carefully. If you're willing, Claire considered, one breath. Late May, she said. Something moved across Vivian's face. Brief, private, almost imperceptible. May was Gerald's favorite month, she said. Gerald. Nathaniel's father, her husband. Then she walked out. The town car pulled away smoothly. Claire sat in the lobby chair for a long time. Her hand was on her stomach. The door was open by 1 inch. That was something. He went to Sunday dinner. Claire had suggested it. Go, she said. Talk to her. Not about the baby, not about me, about everything that's been sitting between you two for 12 years. He had looked at her the way he always did when she said something that surprised him, like she had just moved a piece on a board he had been studying for a long time and shown him an option he hadn't seen. You're not worried about what she'll say. I already know what she'll say, Claire said. I'm more interested in what you say back. He went. He came back 3 hours later. He sat on her couch. She brought him tea, sat across from him, waited. We had a conversation we should have had 12 years ago, he said finally, about what I actually need versus what she's been assuming I need. How did she take it? Badly at first. He held the mug in both hands, the thinking posture, sitting down. Then better. She told me she'd spoken to you. I wondered if she would tell you first. He almost smiled. Smart. Occasionally. He set the mug down, leaned forward. I told her that you and I are building a life together, he said. That, I intend to. He stopped, looked up at her. I should say this differently. I intend to ask you, if you want that. That's not a, Keep going, Claire said. You can circle back to that part. He pressed on. I told her that our child is coming, that she is going to be part of that child's life, and that the degree to which she is part of that life depends entirely on the choices she makes going forward. How did she respond? She said she was aware of that. A pause. She cried, which I have seen her do approximately 4 times in my entire life, so I'm counting it as meaningful. Claire absorbed this. I also told her, Nathaniel said, that the gala was not going to go unaddressed. What does that mean? I spoke with our communications team and with the foundation board. My mother has been removed from her honorary chair position on the gala committee. Claire stared at him. Nathaniel, it's not permanent. It's a consequence. His voice was very steady. She doesn't get to publicly humiliate the woman I love and face no consequence because she's my mother. That is not how things should work. And I am done letting things work the wrong way because it's easier to redirect than confront. She's going to be furious. She already was. He met Claire's eyes directly, and then she understood why it was necessary, which I think is the most mature thing she's said to me in years. Claire sat back. She thought about Vivian in the lobby. The word cruel, unprompted, unqualified. No spin, no softening, no linguistic escape hatch. People surprised you. Even people you thought you had completely figured out. There's something else, Nathaniel said. She looked at him. I've been speaking with my estate attorneys about the legal structure, about making sure that you... He paused. That there is no question about where you and our child stand. Legally, clearly, permanently. Nathaniel, you don't have to... I know I don't have to. I want to. His eyes held hers. I have spent 12 years learning to manage things, redirect them, handle them at a distance. I don't want to manage this. I want to do it correctly. She looked at this man, this complicated, smart, occasionally oblivious man who had canceled Sunday dinner and then gone back to Sunday dinner and had the conversation that needed having. Who had said the best news I've received in years without hesitating? You said something earlier, she said, about circling back. He went still. About asking me something. A long beat, and then very quietly. Will you... Yes, she said. Before he finished, he blinked. I haven't finished the question. I know what you were going to ask. You might be wrong. I'm not wrong. He looked at her. She looked at him, and something that had been uncertain settled between them with the quiet finality of something that was simply true. I don't have a ring, he said. I was going to... We have time, she said, and they did. They had all the time in the world. The statement went out on a Monday morning. Nathaniel's team had drafted it. Claire had read it and suggested 3 changes, and he had implemented all 3 without discussion. It was clean, direct. 3 paragraphs. Nathaniel Holt and Claire Whitman were expecting a child. They were committed to their future together. What occurred at the Foundation Winter Gala was not reflective of family or foundation values. Appropriate steps had been taken to address it. The internet responded as the internet does. Brenda sent a voice memo that was 45 seconds of noise, followed by, Claire Whitman, you are having a billionaire's baby and the whole world is rooting for you. Claire's mother called and cried for 11 minutes. Claire sat in her apartment eating crackers and reading through it all, with the slightly detached feeling of someone watching a story about themselves that is not entirely wrong, but is also not entirely right. She read the comments from women who had been in similar situations, who had been looked at the way Vivian had looked at her, who had tried to earn approval that was never going to be given because approval wasn't what was actually on offer. She read the message from one woman who wrote simply, You didn't run, and that matters to me. She cried a little at that one, just briefly. On Wednesday, Vivian released her own statement. Nathaniel showed it to Claire before it went public. He had insisted on that. It was formal, precise, very Vivian. Her conduct at the Foundation Gala had been inappropriate. She offered a sincere apology to Claire Whitman. She looked forward to welcoming a grandchild into the family. No qualifications, no contextualizing, no revision of the history. Just inappropriate, sincere apology. Grandchild. Claire read it 3 times. Then she found a piece of paper. Real paper. She rarely used real paper. She wrote a note in her own handwriting. It said, Thank you. That took courage. I see that. Claire. She addressed it to the Holt estate and mailed it. She did not know what would come next. She was not naive enough to expect transformation. 62 years of pattern does not come undone in 2 weeks. Vivian was who she was. But Vivian had said the word cruel unprompted. She had released a statement without softening. She had shown up to a lobby and sat across a table and told the truth. That was something to build on. Not much, but something. January came cold and clear and relentless. Claire was 14 weeks, beginning to show, just slightly, just enough that she pressed her hand to the small swell every morning the way people touch something fragile and beloved, and knew the nausea was easing, her appetite was returning. She was eating real meals again, and sleeping better, and feeling, for the first time in months, like her body was something she lived in rather than negotiated with. She went back to work. She had expected it to feel strange. The building Nathaniel owned, her desk, her colleagues, all of it loaded with context now. It felt instead like solid ground. Her boss said, on her first morning back, "You look well. Whatever you did during leave clearly agreed with you." She smiled and said thank you and sat at her desk and felt herself exhale in a way she hadn't been able to for weeks. She needed this. The ordinary, the rhythm, the vendor contracts and the spreadsheets and the lunch at her desk with her book. Life continued being life even while the dramatic parts of it were ongoing. She had always known that intellectually. Now she knew it the other way, the deeper way. She also had an attorney now. His name was Gerald Sparks. He was 60 years old and had been doing family law for 35 years, and when she walked into his office, with Nathaniel's estate documentation, he looked it over with the face of a man who was mildly impressed. "He's protecting you comprehensively," Gerald said. "And the child." "Yes," she said. "This is more thorough than standard partnership documentation." He looked over his glasses at her. "Do you trust this man?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation. She signed what was appropriate to sign, left what she preferred in her own name, kept her own bank accounts, kept her own apartment through the end of her lease. She was not in a hurry, and she trusted Nathaniel. But she was also Claire Whitman, who had built her own life carefully and deliberately, and she was not going to dismantle it at speed just because things were moving quickly. Nathaniel understood that. He had said so without prompting. "I don't want you to lose yourself in this," he told her. "I want to add to your life, not replace it," she said. Yes. She had kissed him for that. The therapy started in February, her own idea. She had been thinking about it since December. She found a therapist named Dr. Patricia Hollis, who had a calm office near Lincoln Park and a way of asking questions that felt like being given permission to think something you had been actively avoiding. At the first session, Dr. Hollis asked why she had come. "Something happened recently," Claire said. "A public incident. It shook me more than I expected, and I want to understand why I let things build to that point before addressing them." "What do you mean by let things build?" "I saw warning signs," Claire said, early and clearly, "and I convinced myself I was wrong about them. And then they turned out to be exactly what they appeared." "Why do you think you convinced yourself?" Claire thought about that. "Because acknowledging them would have required a decision," she said slowly. "And I wasn't ready to make that decision, so I chose not to know." Dr. Hollis nodded. They talked for 50 minutes. At the end, Dr. Hollis said, "Same time next week?" "Yes," Claire said. "Please." By the third session, she was talking about the cage, the self-imposed monitoring, the constant checking of herself before speaking in certain spaces, the performance of the version of herself she had decided was most acceptable in the world she had entered. "Who built that cage?" Dr. Hollis asked. A very long pause. "I did," Claire thought. "Vivian handed me the lumber, but I built it myself." She said it out loud. Dr. Hollis nodded slowly. "What do you do with that?" Claire asked. "What do you think you do with it?" She looked out the window. February bare trees, gray sky, clean cold light. "You notice it," she said, "and then you stop doing it, one choice at a time, until the new way is the normal way." Dr. Hollis smiled. Not the answer. The direction of the answer. Which was better, actually. You could follow a direction. An answer just sits there. She was 15 weeks when the first movement happened. Or what she thought was movement. A flutter. Something turning over in the warmth of her. Like something saying hello from the inside. She was at her desk. 7:45 in the morning. Coffee cooling beside her. Reading a vendor contract. She went completely still. Hello, she thought back. I've got you. Take your time. She went back to the contract and smiled to herself, just slightly, the smile of someone who has a secret that is entirely, completely, joyfully hers. Vivienne called in January to ask about the pregnancy. It was brief, careful. Like two people talking across a bridge, they are both still building from their respective ends. Vivienne asked about the due date, which she already knew, about the OB, about whether Claire had found out the sex yet. Not yet, Claire said. They talked for 12 minutes. It was almost comfortable. Almost. Claire told Brenda about it afterward. 12 minutes, Brenda said. I know. That's like 4 normal conversations with Vivian Holt compressed. It's fragile, Claire said. I'm not pretending it isn't, but she's trying to operate differently. And I think... She paused. I think that matters. Even incomplete. Even slow. You are a more generous person than I would be, Brenda said. I'm a pragmatic person, Claire said. She is going to be in my child's life. I can spend years at war with her, or I can try to build something imperfect that works. I prefer the second option, even after the gala. Especially after the gala. I don't have to forget it. I don't have to pretend it didn't happen. But I am not going to let it define everything that comes after. She paused. The hardest part is admitting that I understand how she got there. She was afraid. She handled the fear terribly, but I understand where it came from. A silence. Claire, Brenda said. Yeah. I think you're going to be a really good mother. Claire's throat tightened, just briefly. Thanks, Bren, she said. He proposed in February. Not at a restaurant, not in front of people, not with a plan that had clearly been prepared in advance and executed with the particular pressure of a planned moment. He did it at 7 in the morning in her kitchen over coffee. She was in her bathrobe. Her hair was still loose. She was eating toast and reading an article on her tablet about office ergonomics, because she was who she was. He sat across from her with his coffee mug, set it down, looked at her directly. I've been thinking about how to do this, he said. I've been thinking about it since November, actually, and I have come to the conclusion that you are someone who would find a performance of this more uncomfortable than meaningful. She put down her toast. Okay. He reached into the pocket of his jacket. She had not even noticed he was still wearing his jacket. She had assumed he was staying the night, and put a ring box on the table between them. He did not open it. Claire Whitman, he said, you are the most direct, most organized, most genuinely herself person I have ever known. You told me no to lunch on the day we met, and you meant it. You told me the truth about the baby when it terrified you, and you meant that too. You walked out of a room with 300 people watching, and you did it with more dignity than I've managed in my entire career. He paused. I would like to spend my life with you, if you would like that too. She looked at the ring box, then at him. Yes, she said. He opened the box. The ring was beautiful, not large, not ostentatious, a single diamond set simply in warm gold. He had chosen it himself, she could tell. It was not a ring that had been selected by a jeweler to impress. It was a ring that had been selected by someone who paid attention. He slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Of course it did. He paid attention. She looked at it on her hand, then back at him. You measured my finger while I was sleeping, she said. I borrowed one of your rings briefly and had a jeweler size it. That's slightly invasive. I was going to say thorough. He laughed. She laughed. And then she got up from the table and sat on his lap and kissed him properly, and the toast went cold, and neither of them minded. The wedding was in April. Small 40 people. Her parents flew in. Her sister came with her husband and their 2 kids. Brenda was her witness in a green dress she had bought in 30 minutes, and which looked like it had been made for her specifically. Nathaniel's friends, most of whom Claire had grown genuinely fond of over the past year. His college roommate, who cried during the vows and then was magnificently embarrassed about it. His business partner, who made a toast that was 3 minutes of genuine feeling and 1 perfectly placed joke. Vivienne was there. She sat in the second row. She wore a silver-gray dress that was elegant and appropriate and drew no attention from anyone. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched her son marry the woman she had once attacked in a ballroom with a glass of wine. She did not cry during the vows, but she looked the entire time like someone managing something large and private, something she was choosing to manage gracefully for the first time. Claire caught her eye once, briefly. Vivienne nodded. Small, precise. Claire nodded back. That was all. But it was enough. The reception was at a venue with a garden, bare but beautiful in April. There was dancing. There was the kind of laughter that happens when people who love each other are in the same room. At one point, Brenda found Claire near the bar and said, I need you to know that this is the best party I have ever attended, and I will be talking about this for the rest of my life. It's just dinner, Claire said. It's dinner after everything, Brenda said. That's different. She was right. It was different. It was dinner after the gala, and the wine and the cab ride home, and the shower and the midnight kitchen, and the secret, and the conversation, and the lobby, and the apology, and the statement, and the proposal, and all of it. It was dinner at the end of the hardest year and the beginning of something else. Claire danced with her father. He held her the way he had when she was small. Both hands. Steady. I'm proud of you, he said, just that. He was not a man of many words, but the ones he used were always the right ones. She pressed her face into his shoulder for a moment. Thanks, Dad, she said. She was born on a Tuesday in late May, 6 pounds, 14 ounces. Dark hair, like Nathaniel. Eyes still the undecided gray-blue of all new eyes, waiting to settle into what they would become. 10 fingers and 10 toes, counted twice, by both parents independently. They named her Frances, after Claire's grandmother on her father's side. Frances, who had been a practical, warm, no-nonsense woman who had outlived 2 husbands and raised 6 children, and told Claire when she was 12 years old, the most important thing is to know your own mind. Everything else follows from that. Frances Claire Holt, a name with history in it, weight and warmth, and the specific gravity of people who came before. Nathaniel held her first. Claire had insisted. She watched him from the hospital bed. This man she had loved for almost 2 years, holding their daughter for the first time, with the expression of someone who has been handed something he did not know he was missing. His face in that moment was a thing she would carry for the rest of her life. She had her own moment later, when the nurse settled Frances into her arms, and she looked down, and Frances looked up, and they regarded each other with the serious attention of 2 people, meeting for the first time, who both somehow already know each other. Hello, she thought. I've been waiting for you, Frances blinked. Vivienne came to the hospital the next morning. She came alone. No Patrice, no agenda visible in her hands or on her face, just Vivienne in a good coat with a small white box of something from the bakery she had been going to for 30 years. She stood in the doorway of the hospital room. Claire was sitting up in the bed, Francis in the clear bassinet beside her, Nathaniel standing near the window with the particular, satisfied tiredness of a man who had been awake for 22 hours and would do it again gladly. Vivienne looked at the bassinet. She crossed the room, slowly, sat in the chair beside it, and looked at Francis for a very long time without saying anything. Claire watched her. The bakery box sat forgotten on the bedside table. Vivienne was very still, her hands folded in her lap, her face doing something private and large. "She has Gerald's nose," she said finally, barely above a whisper. "We thought the same thing," Nathaniel said. Vivienne looked at her granddaughter for a little longer. "May you arrived in," she said, addressing Francis directly. Her voice was different than Claire had ever heard it. Stripped of all the careful management, just a voice, just a woman. May was his favorite. He would have loved you extravagantly. Something moved in Claire's chest. She let herself feel it. The complicated fullness of it, the love, the exhaustion, the strangeness, the enormous ordinary miracle of a new person existing in the world. Vivienne reached out one finger, the gesture of a person approaching something precious. Francis's tiny fist, already full of opinions, closed around it. And Vivienne Holt, 62 years old, veteran of every boardroom and charity gala and family battle the Chicago social world had to offer, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry. Human, entirely human. Claire looked at Nathaniel. He was looking at his mother, with something she had never quite seen on his face before. Not the managed love, not the careful distance, just love, simple and uncomplicated and right there. "Would you like to hold her?" Claire asked. Vivienne looked up. Something moved through her expression. If that would be... No. "Here," Claire said, and lifted Francis very gently, and put her in Vivienne's arms. And Vivienne Holt held her granddaughter for the first time, and went entirely quiet, and completely still, and looked down at Francis with an expression that finally showed Claire what was underneath all of it. Not spite, not control, not the accumulated armor of 62 years of protecting what she loved. Just love. The same thing. At the bottom of all of it. Just love. 3 months after Francis was born, Claire went back to work. Her own decision. No one had asked her to. No one had suggested a timeline. She had simply known, around week 10 of maternity leave, that she was ready, that she wanted both things, the work and the home. She had never been someone who could choose just one. Nathaniel said, "Then don't choose." So she didn't. She had kept her own office at Holt Financial, her own role. She had turned down a larger position he offered her because she did not want a title she hadn't earned through her own work. He had laughed, said, "You are never going to make this easy on me, are you?" "No," she said. "That's what you love about me." He couldn't argue with that. She hired a nanny she liked and trusted, came home every evening to find Francis either asleep or very emphatically awake and opinionated about it. Spent her mornings at work and her evenings at home, and felt, for the first time in her adult life, like all the parts of herself were in the right proportions. Sutton called. This surprised Claire. She had not heard from Sutton since the brief call after the gala statement, but she called on a Wednesday afternoon in June, just to check in, to see how things were, to say she had seen the announcement about the baby. "Congratulations," Sutton said. "She sounds wonderful." "She really is," Claire said. A pause. "I've been thinking," Sutton said, "about the kind of people we choose to be when we're put in a position between someone with power and someone without it." "And?" And I think I made the wrong choice for a long time, including at that dinner in March. A pause. I'm trying to make different choices now. That's all any of us can do, Claire said. They talked for 20 minutes. Sutton was funny, more direct than Claire had expected, warmer. When she hung up, she thought, people are more than their worst moments, including me, including Vivian, including Sutton, including everyone. Frances learned to smile at 6 weeks, real smiles, the kind that scientists insist are reflexes, and that every parent in the history of humanity has refused to believe are only reflexes. Claire had been holding her on a Sunday morning, just the two of them in the kitchen, Nathaniel still asleep, coffee made. The smell of rosemary from the herb pot on the windowsill. Morning light coming through clean and gold and quiet. Frances looked at her and smiled, like she recognized her, like she had always recognized her. Claire pressed her forehead to her daughter's forehead, felt the warmth of it, the impossible smallness and completeness of this small person. Hey, she thought, there you are. Frances blinked, wiggled one fist. Hey yourself, that seemed to say. Vivienne came on Sundays now, most of them. She brought food that required more preparation than any reasonable person would put into a casual visit. Elaborate pastries, a soup that took 4 hours, an entire poached salmon one weekend that required a dish Claire didn't own, and Vivian had brought in a bag without commenting. Claire had started to understand that this was how Vivian expressed love. Through effort, through preparation, through bringing the most elaborate version of the thing because ordinary effort would not communicate the depth of the feeling. It was not so different from how Claire expressed care, really. She just did it with spreadsheets and organized systems instead of poached salmon. They were not best friends. They would never be best friends. They were too different, too shaped by too many different decades of experience and expectation. But they were honest with each other now, in a way that neither of them had managed to be before. And honest, Claire had discovered, was more sustainable than easy. Easier, in the long run, than anything she had tried before. Once, over coffee, at the kitchen table, while Frances napped, Vivian said without preamble, I underestimated you. Yes, Claire said, you did. I don't usually underestimate people. I know. I imagine that made it more surprising. Something moved in Vivian's face, almost a smile. The Vivian version of a smile, which was a slight softening of everything rather than a movement of the mouth. It made it more inconvenient, she said. They drank their coffee. For what it's worth, Claire said, I understand now why you fought the way you did. I don't think it was right, but I understand it. Vivian looked at her directly, which was itself a thing she had not always done. I was afraid, she said. That is not an excuse, but it is the truth. I know. I was afraid of losing him the way I lost Gerald. Not to death, to distance, to a life that no longer had room for me in the way I had been used to. He wouldn't have let that happen, Claire said. I know that now. A pause. I knew it then, too. I just chose to operate from fear rather than knowledge. Silence. You're doing better, Claire said. That matters. I am trying to do better, Vivian said, which was, for Vivian, the most honest possible version of the same thing. They finished their coffee. Frances woke up from her near nap and announced herself from the other room with the particular authority of a baby who has decided sleep is done. Vivian stood up, straightened her jacket. I'll get her, she said, and walked down the hall to do exactly that. Claire sat at the kitchen table with her empty mug and listened to Vivian's voice. That voice built for boardrooms and gala speeches and the silencing of opposition go soft and warm in her daughter's room. Something settled in her chest. Not everything, Not all of it. There were still moments. There would always be moments. The history did not disappear. The gala would always have happened. The wine on the cream dress would always have happened. But it was not the thing that defined what came after. She had decided that. Not easily, not all at once, in small increments over many months. She had decided that what Vivian had done to her was real and wrong, and she did not have to pretend otherwise. And she had also decided that it was not going to be the load-bearing wall of her future. She was not going to build a life around avoiding or fighting or proving something to a woman whose opinion, ultimately, was not the measure of her value. Her value was not something she needed to demonstrate. She had always known that. It had just taken a ruined dress and 11 months of complicated navigation and one very honest session with Dr. Patricia Hollis to fully believe it. She thought about the woman she had been in that hotel corridor, the wine smell, the cold marble, her hand going to her stomach without thinking. The cab home, the shower, the midnight kitchen. I want to say something to her, Claire thought, to that woman. Not something dramatic, not something inspirational, nothing you would put on a poster in a waiting room. Just, you're going to be okay, more than okay. You're going to be someone's mother. You're going to figure out what you're actually made of, and it's going to be more than you thought. The woman across from you at the gala, the one with the wine glass, is going to hold your daughter on a Sunday morning and make her laugh. That's the world, complicated and human and full of things that don't resolve clean. That's the world, and you are going to live in it well. On a morning in August, Nathaniel found Claire at the kitchen window with Frances on her shoulder. Frances was 4 months old and very interested in the world outside the glass. She pressed one small palm flat against it, focused intensely on a pigeon. Important meeting? Nathaniel said. Very, Claire said. We're studying birds. He came and stood beside them, put his arm around her, the three of them at the window in the early morning. The city below moving through its ordinary August business, entirely unaware of being observed. Dr. Hollis asked me something this week, Claire said. Yeah? She asked what I would tell myself from a year ago. He was quiet for a moment. What did you say? Claire thought about it. I said I would tell her to stop making herself smaller, to fit spaces that weren't built for her size. She paused. And to trust what she saw when she saw it. And to know that the thing she was most afraid of, the public humiliation, the judgment, the question of whether she deserved to be there, none of those things ended up being the things that mattered. What mattered? He asked. She looked at Frances, at the small, intense face studying the pigeon, at the pale morning light on her daughter's dark hair. Whether I was willing to build something real, she said, through the hard parts. Whether I was willing to keep going, even when it was uncomfortable and unclear, and there was wine on my dress in front of 300 people. She paused. Whether I was brave enough to tell the truth, even when the timing was terrible. Frances made a sound, disapproving, apparently, of the pigeon's decision to leave. Claire turned her slightly, showed her a different view. The prison door had been unlocked the whole time, she said. I just needed to walk through it. Nathaniel was quiet, the particular quiet of someone listening all the way. Did she ask anything else? He said finally. She asked if I had regrets. And? Claire looked at her daughter. This complete, particular, extraordinary small person who had arrived at exactly the worst possible moment and made everything make sense. None, she said. Frances grabbed a fistful of Claire's hair, with tremendous conviction. Nathaniel laughed. Claire untangled her hair from her daughter's grip. Carefully, the way you handle things you love. Outside the window, August moved through the city, bright and warm and entirely ordinary. Inside, Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. Not perfect, not a version of perfect, not the clean resolution of a story that wraps up without residue. Real, complicated, ongoing, human. Hers, all of it. Entirely, beautifully hers.
Before we go, I want to sit with you for just a moment longer, because this story is not really about a gala. It's not really about wine on a dress or a billionaire's family or a public humiliation that went viral. This story is about something that happens quietly, in ordinary lives, in ordinary relationships, every single day. It's about what we do when someone tries to define us. When someone with more power, more money, more social standing looks at us and decides, before we've spoken a single word, that we don't belong, that we're not enough, that we're a threat to be eliminated rather than a person to be known, and it's about what we do next. Claire didn't fight back the way movies tell us women should fight back. She didn't deliver the perfect cutting remark. She didn't expose anyone dramatically. She didn't perform her dignity for an audience. She just kept being herself under the worst possible conditions. She kept her spine straight when every nerve in her body was telling her to collapse. She told the truth when the timing was catastrophic. She opened a door 1 inch for a woman who had tried to close every door available to her. That is not weakness. That is the hardest kind of strength there is. The first lesson this story leaves us: your worth is not something you need to demonstrate to anyone. Not to a mother-in-law, not to a room full of wealthy strangers, not to a comment section, not to anyone who has decided before knowing you that you are less than you are. You don't audition for your own life. You live it. And anyone who requires a performance from you before they'll grant you basic dignity, that is about their fear, not your value. The second lesson, paying attention to warning signs, is not paranoia. It is self-respect. Claire saw the signs early. She chose not to see them, not because she was foolish, but because acknowledging them would have required a decision she wasn't ready to make. How many of us have done the same thing? How many of us have looked directly at something that was hurting us and said, no, I must be imagining it. I must be too sensitive. I must be making this bigger than it is. You are not too sensitive. You are not imagining it. Trust what you see when you see it. Your observations are data. Use them. The third lesson, forgiveness is not the same as forgetting, and understanding someone is not the same as excusing them. Claire never pretended the gala didn't happen. She never performed a healing she didn't feel, but she also chose not to let that one terrible night become the foundation of everything that followed. She held both things at once, the genuine harm and the genuine human being capable of more than their worst moment. That is a rare and difficult skill, but it is the skill that makes real peace possible, not the performed kind, the actual kind. The fourth lesson, and perhaps the most important one, the cage is often one we build ourselves. Dr. Hollis asked Claire who built the cage, and Claire realized Vivian may have handed her the materials, but she had constructed it with her own hands. The constant monitoring, the adjusting, the performing the acceptable version of herself, the making herself smaller to fit spaces that were never built for her full size. Nobody asked her to do that. She had done it out of a desire to belong, out of love, out of the very human need to be accepted by the people who matter to the people we love. But the prison door had been unlocked the whole time. It is unlocked for you too. The moment you stop performing and simply are, is the moment everything actually begins. And the final thing this story wants to leave you with is this: starting over is not failure. It is just the next chapter beginning. Whatever you are carrying right now, whatever secret, whatever fear, whatever situation that feels too complicated to navigate, you are not the only one. You are not alone in the middle of it. and you are more capable of walking through it with your head up than you currently believe. Claire stood in a ballroom with wine on her dress and walked out with her dignity intact. So can you. This story was researched, developed, and manually crafted by our team with the intention of bringing you not just entertainment, but meaning, healing, and something worth carrying with you long after the final word. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. That tells us something about who you are. Until next time, take care of yourself. You are worth that.